I hope you enjoyed reading The Cold Equations. Spoiler alert, please do not watch this video unless you've finished the story. We're going to discuss a few of the issues to sort of give you a springboard. We also will be talking about the story and the scientific issues in our blog. So we hope to see you in the blog, but right now, let's talk about some big picture issues with The Cold Equations. One question that we always have to ask about stories is, when was it written and what does the title mean? And so those are questions I would like you to think about, and of course keep in mind, how does that relate to the astrophysics of the story as well? Jeff?
I love this story, and I don't know how many times we've taught around, but every time I read this story, it makes me mad at the end, and because there's just no escape. And that's the essence of course, the title of the story, as it applies to a real life situation, but that you just cannot escape the laws of physics. And everything in this story is correct from the physics point of view. And I'm going to discuss some of the details a little bit later.
And I just want to add that gender is an important issue here, too, in that who is the stowaway? What are her salient features, physical, emotional, mental, and how do those features contrast with the male pilot? There is a moral to this story. It has been selected as one of the top science fiction stories of all time, but it has also been trenchantly criticized for its very hyper-traditional depiction of gender roles. And so we want to think about how the writer sort of manipulates the story to come to the conclusion that he wants to enunciate to you, the reader. So you can be a resistant reader and have some questions for the author as well.
So what year was it written?
It was written in the 1950s. So that's something I know most of our students don't remember, the 1950s. So you may want to Google gender roles in the 1950s, and I think you would learn that things were very different back then.
Well, think Mad Men.
Yes, that's right. You probably have seen Mad Men or some other period television shows. Keep in mind, though, that TV shows are not always a documentary. They're not 100% accurate. And we will be talking about ways that you can research and write about a time period in order to, understand a short story or a TV show better.
So the story starts out with the pilot looking at his dials and seeing that one of the dials is off and that it indicates something's wrong. And so that's the first thing to think about, is how is he detecting the stowaway with his dials? What kind of sensory equipment is being used? And then once he finds the stowaway, of course, he has to deal with the way that this story has been set up. And it's almost like one of those murder mysteries where they find the body and it's locked in a room and there's no escape and there's no murderer there. Because it's all set up in a certain way to make the reader frustrated, because, and of course the pilot himself, because this ship, this emergency rescue ship, has been built especially to have very lightweight, very fast, and have resources, no extra resources, so that it has just enough fuel to get to the planet, leave the vaccine, and get back safely. And so he has just enough rocket fuel to get there, to stop, land, and take off again. And this has all been set up with the weight of the spacecraft in mind. It includes him and the spacecraft. And as you may note during the story, there's nothing that can be thrown overboard except the pilot or the stowaway.
But remember, the author has made that choice. And while it is within that world scientifically accurate, you could envision a story that had different parameters. So that's one job you can have as a reader, is how could this be changed, or how would you change it, or how would changing some of the contingencies change the whole experience of the story. So you can question what an author does, but then we have to step back and say, given this worldview? Why did he create it this way? And what is the message for you as the reader? If you're unaware of science, what is likely to be your experience if you think science is unimportant or it's not going to affect you? Marilyn Cross finds out that it really is going to be important to her. So there's a lesson there for readers.
I mentioned the setup being very realistic, and one of the things is, what does the pilot do when he discovers her? Obviously, he's shocked because he already knows what the rules are, and he knows in his heart that there's only two choices. One of the two people has to go out the airlock, and but he does go through the motions. He contacts his mothership. He asks them if there's any other ship close enough to rescue them. And he does everything he can think of to delay the inevitable. The inevitable is caused by one of the best known laws of physics, which is one of Newton's laws of motion, his second law, which is F equals ma. And that's force equals mass times acceleration. And what that means is when you're launching a rocket, the force needed to get off the planet depends on the mass of the rocket itself. And then acceleration is how fast the speed is changing. And so the faster you want to accelerate, the more force you have to apply. But if you're thinking about your spaceship being not moving at first, then the rocket engine has to fire, speed up the spaceship to the speed you want to go. It goes to the planet, and then it has to fire again to slow it down, go into orbit, or to land on the planet. And so all of that takes rocket fuel. And so they've made this calculation using F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. And obviously, if I were designing this spaceship, I would put in a little extra rocket fuel just in case something happens, but then, of course, it wouldn't be as fun a story. And so, but he's faced with this problem that mass has changed. The mass of Marilyn Cross has been added to the mass of the spacecraft and the mass of him, and of course the rocket fuel. And so that throws off the calculation that when they get to the planet, he won't have enough fuel with this extra mass on board to stop the rocket and then get back safely. And of course he runs into this problem. Obviously, this is the 1950s, and you would think that he would offer to throw himself out the airlock. But the author's really smart here, because there's this epidemic going on this planet. Other people are going to die. It's not just him. And so in order to save those other people, deliver the vaccine safely, he's the only one that can pilot the ship. And so if it had just been her versus him, I think it might have been a very different ending.
Well, I would encourage you to look very closely at the language. How are the characters described? How are you manipulated into feeling one way or another about the characters and about this situation? So we look forward to talking to you about this in the live blog, and I also look forward to your answers to the English quiz, which will ask you to kind of break the story down in the same way that Jeff has broken down the laws of physics for you and how they're important in the story.
And be sure to read the story, because it's really one of my favorites. And I think you'll enjoy it, although, like I said, you might be a bit mad at the end.